This is WDDM News for today, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy today wrapped up a whirlwind tour of the politically crucial state of Texas by lauding his administration's military increases and redoubling his commitment to help Southeast Asian nations fight communism. Speaking at his hotel in Fort Worth, then at the Dallas Trade Mart, Mr. Kennedy said a 60% increase in tactical U.S. nuclear weapons in Western Europe and an increase of 10 times that much in special forces have strengthened America. Special forces are prepared to work with U.S. allies against the guerrillas, saboteurs, insurgents, and assassins, the president said. In one of the few references to the civil rights issue Mr. Kennedy made in his two-day sweep through Texas, the president tied the matter of racial discrimination to the strength of our foreign policy. Addressing a luncheon at the Trade Mart attended by Dallas's political and economic leaders, the president said overwhelming military, diplomatic, and economic strength will be ineffective if diplomats from non-white nations are subjected to discrimination here. A slight change in the presidential motorcade's route to the Trade Mart was made this morning so that a car carrying Mr. Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally would avoid a building where a suspiciously behaving man was an employee. That man, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, had been arrested early in the morning in the suburb of Irving as he was about to ride to work at the Texas School Book Depository on North Houston Street. Oswald, an order filler there, was found to be hiding a rifle in brown paper wrapping he had set on the back seat of the car of a co-worker who was about to drive him to the depository to start the morning shift. That co-worker called police when Oswald became belligerent after he asked Oswald what the wrapping contained. Just after this Trade Mart speech, the president thanked Dallas area police for helping the Secret Service protect him on the trip and made specific mention of the arrest of the depository employee. As of tonight, police and the FBI are still questioning Oswald to determine whether the gun he sneaked into the car may have posed a threat to the president and Governor Connally. Police started a thorough search of the book depository and altered the motorcade's route because Oswald had been in the building during the days before the president's visit. After leaving Dallas, President and Mrs. Kennedy flew to Austin, where they and Governor Connally met with state legislative leaders. The overall purpose of the Texas visit was to reduce tensions between the state Democratic Party's conservative wing, headed by Connally, and its liberal wing, led by Senator Ralph Yarborough. The friendly, enthusiastic crowds persuaded members of both political factions that the trip was a success. Governor Connally recalled that his wife Nell leaned forward in the car after it had passed miles of smiling, waving people, and she remarked to the president that no one could say Dallas doesn't love you. The governor said a smiling and confident President Kennedy responded, "You certainly can't." This is WDDM News for today, February 20, 1964. President Kennedy spoke to cheering crowds in Tokyo today, then later to Americans watching on television. The president became the first U.S. chief executive to speak live to his countrymen while away, as a satellite transmission from Japan brought home his message. Mr. Kennedy said the fact that he can address Americans while on the other side of the world proves the importance of our space program and highlights the advanced nature of American technology. To both nations' peoples, the president lauded the American-Japanese friendship that has existed for 19 years since the end of the Second World War. After briefly mentioning his own naval service in the Pacific during that war, Mr. Kennedy talked from then on about the two former enemy nations' close military and economic alliances, which he said his administration has sought to strengthen. He also talked up Japan's upcoming presence at the 1964 World's Fair in New York City, which begins in 8 weeks and will have as its theme Peace Through Understanding. And of course, 1964 was an election year as John F. Kennedy sought a second term. WDDM News for today, March 3rd, 1964. Facing a revolt from conservative Southern Democrats and disillusionment from civil rights leaders on the left, President Kennedy made campaign visits this week to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania ahead of their crucial primary elections. The president reiterated his determination to get the Civil Rights Bill approved before the general election, November 3. Yet he sought to quell rumblings by Southern Party leaders reminiscent of 1948, the year South Carolina's Strom Thurmond walked out of the Democratic convention and ran as a third party candidate for president. This year, party liberals worry Alabama Governor George Wallace could attempt to move like Thurmond's 1948 run. Wallace has condemned the president and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, for, as Wallace sees it, trying to wreck the Southern tradition of race segregation. Insiders have speculated that Robert Kennedy may leave his Attorney General post and possibly return to the job of JFK campaign manager, a position at which he excelled in the president's election campaign 4 years ago. A replacement Attorney General less associated with civil rights actions could also help keep Southern states in President Kennedy's column in November. Meanwhile, anonymous sources inside the White House have suggested that Vice President Lyndon Johnson could drop off the JFK ticket this time, though the Vice President has denied he is mulling that. Across the aisle, the Republican Party is undergoing divisiveness of its own, as moderate Nelson Rockefeller wants to move the nation in a pro-civil rights direction, but staunch conservative Barry Goldwater, who is challenging him for the Republican presidential nomination, is vehemently opposed to the Civil Rights Bill, calling it an infringement on the rights of business owners. With both parties struggling over how to handle civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders of the cause say Negro Americans cannot wait for action to end segregation and would not support Mr. Kennedy this fall without the Civil Rights Bill being brought up for a vote in Congress, but would not back any Republican nominee for president unless the GOP convention platform strongly commits to the bill. And now John F. Kennedy returns to his great strength as a TV debater. WDDM News today, October 15, 1964. President Kennedy and Senator Goldwater traded sharp barbs in their televised debate tonight as the Arizona Republican tried to cut into the president's strong poll lead. Goldwater said that while Mr. Kennedy eloquently declared 3 years ago that the torch had been passed to a new generation, he said the president today could be using it for a white flag, referring to the U.S. failure to stop North Vietnam's aggression or the construction of the Berlin Wall. The president countered that the 50,000 American soldiers he has placed in South Vietnam have stabilized that nation. He also attacked Goldwater's proposal to let major generals in certain circumstances order a nuclear strike without presidential authority. Mr. Kennedy said if he were to write a book about Senator Goldwater's nuclear ideas, he'd call this book Profiles in Chaos. President Kennedy marked the one-year point since his thunderous re-election to a second term by signing a civil rights bill into law today, ending segregation and discrimination based on race, religion, color, creed, or national origin. The bill's passage through a divided Congress was aided by a deal brokered by Vice President Johnson to get moderate House and Senate members to support the bill in return for Mr. Kennedy's agreement to send more combat troops to South Vietnam and to step up bombing of North Vietnam. The vice president strongly favors the Civil Rights Act and a more aggressive posture in Vietnam's war. But many liberals and civil rights leaders have condemned tying the war to ending segregation, and some of them protested in front of the White House today. Former Vice President Richard Nixon keynoted a rally of Republicans in Washington today, questioning President Kennedy's leadership in the face of a national drug epidemic, rising crime, and a lack of progress in the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, Congress adjourned without acting on the president's proposal for a Medicare program for the elderly or expanded funding for the nation's public schools. Meanwhile, protests on campuses over the war from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Berkeley, California. President Kennedy, back in the White House after briefly being hospitalized at the Walter Reed Center because of his longtime back difficulties, convened a commission to study the recent violence in black sections of Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, and to recommend action. The president has called for federal efforts to bring improved medical care and nutrition to poor neighborhoods. Senator Hubert Humphrey, a likely candidate for president next year, has called for a more sweeping anti-poverty program, while Republican presidential prospects Richard Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller have called for more arrests and prosecution of illegal drug users and armed robbers to bring peace to the cities. Republicans and Democrats have accused the Kennedy administration of failing to be forthcoming about the Vietnam War, and Senator Abraham Ribikoff of Connecticut has called for a congressional investigation to see if the White House has hidden pertinent information about how the U.S. got involved in the war. Perhaps spurred by these criticisms, protests against the war have become larger and more vocal. Outside the White House this morning, a crowd of 50 people chanted, "Hey, hey, JFK, how many kids have you killed today?"